Today I'd like to talk to you about using differentiated instruction in your classroom. And the question comes up, why differentiated instruction when there are so many other different approaches that you can use? Well, there are classrooms filled with students today who have different needs, who come from different educational backgrounds, who have different attention spans and interests, who have different language abilities, and who have different cultural backgrounds. With all of those differences, how can we teach them all the same way? Carol Ann Tomlinson is a leader in the area of differentiated learning and a professor of educational leadership, foundations, and policy at the University of Virginia. Tomlinson describes differentiated instruction as factoring students' individual learning styles and levels of readiness before and during a lesson plan. Research on the effectiveness of differentiation shows that this method benefits a wide range of students, from those with learning disabilities to those who are considered high ability. Differentiated instruction has been described as the teacher's response to learners' needs. Another definition is that differentiated instruction is a method of designing and delivering instruction to best reach each student. Differentiating instruction may mean teaching the same material to all students using a variety of instructional strategies, or it may require the teacher to deliver the lessons at varying levels of difficulty based on the ability of each student. Differentiation is not grouping students in class by ability. It's not something extra in addition to effective instruction. It's not mostly for students with intellectual disabilities. It's not mostly for students identified as gifted. It is not dumbing down instruction for some students. It is not individualized instruction, and it is not a synonym for group work. However, differentiation is the use of formative assessment in instructional practice, valuing and planning for diversity in heterogeneous settings, a student-focused way about teaching and learning, a purposeful use of flexible grouping, lessons designed around patterns of student need, the use of whole group, small groups, and individual tasks based on content and student needs. Necessary for success with standards for a broad range of learners, and differentiation especially is at the core of quality teaching. Differentiated instruction is rooted in both Bloom's taxonomy and Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Differentiation is not another program, rather, it is a philosophy of instruction based on science. Now, according to Tomlinson, teachers can differentiate instruction in 4 ways: content, process, product, and learning environment. Now, I want to discuss with you first how to differentiate content in the classroom. Start with a fundamental lesson plan covering the state standards. You always want to begin with the standards. Understand that some students in the class may be completely unfamiliar with the concepts in a lesson. Some students may have partial mastery, and some students may already be familiar with the content before the lesson even begins. The teacher may differentiate the content by designing activities for groups of students that cover various levels of Bloom's taxonomy, ranging from lower order thinking skills to the higher order thinking skills. Those 6 levels are remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. Teachers who want to differentiate in their classrooms must remember that students who are unfamiliar with the lesson plan may be required to complete tasks on those lower levels, remembering and understanding. Students with some memory may be asked to apply and analyze the content. And students at higher levels of mastery may complete tasks in the areas of evaluating and creating. If we do not differentiate, we are teaching some students at a level they are not prepared for. Now I'd like to discuss with you some examples of differentiating content activities. One such activity could be to match vocabulary words to definitions, to read a passage of text and answer the related questions, to think of a situation that happened to a character in a story and construct a different outcome, to differentiate fact from opinion in a story, or to identify an author's position and provide evidence to support his viewpoint, or create a PowerPoint presentation summarizing a lesson. These are just a few examples of ways that you can differentiate content in your instructional practice. Now I want to discuss with you how to differentiate the process in your classroom. Now, each student has a preferred learning style, and successful differentiation includes delivering the material to each style, visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, through words. Not all students require the same amount of support from the teacher, and students could choose to work in pairs, small groups, or even individually. While some students may benefit from one-on-one interaction with the teacher or classroom aide, others may be able to progress by themselves. Teachers can enhance student learning by offering support based on individual needs. Some examples of differentiating the process are to provide textbooks for the visual learners and for word learners, to allow auditory learners to listen to audiobooks, to give kinesthetic learners the opportunity to complete an interactive assignment online. And looking at those three examples, you can see how each one lends itself to the individual learner's strengths. Next, I would like to talk about how we can differentiate product in the classroom. The product is what the student creates, and at the end of the lesson, to demonstrate their mastery of content. This can be in the form of tests, projects, reports, or other activities. Teachers may assign students to complete activities that show mastery of an educational concept in a way the student prefers, based on their learning style. Some examples of differentiating the end product are to read and write learners in the form of a book report. Visual learners can create a graphic organizer of the story. Auditory learners can give an oral report, or kinesthetic learners can build a diorama illustrating the story. Moving on now to how we differentiate the learning environment in the classroom. The conditions for optimal learning include both physical and psychological elements. A flexible classroom layout is key, incorporating various types of furniture and arrangements to support both individual and group work. Psychologically speaking, teachers should use classroom management techniques that support a safe and supportive learning environment. Some examples of differentiating the environment go as follows. You can break some students into reading groups to discuss the assignment. You could allow students to read individually if preferred. Research shows that differentiated instruction is effective for high ability students as well as students with mild to severe disabilities. When students are given more options on how they can learn material, they take on more responsibility for their own learning. Students appear to be more engaged in learning, and there are reportedly fewer discipline problems in classrooms where teachers provide differentiated lessons. Differentiated instruction requires more work during lesson planning, and many teachers struggle to find extra time in their schedule. The learning curve can be steep, and some schools lack professional development resources. There are some pros and cons to differentiated instruction, and I want to address those before we move on. Some of the pros to differentiated instruction include that research shows differentiated instruction is effective for high ability students as well as students with mild to severe disabilities. When students are given more options on how they learn material, they take on more responsibility for their own learning, and they appeared more engaged in their learning when teachers provide differentiated lessons. Some of the cons: differentiated instruction requires more work. There's no way to get around that. However, it is my opinion, and the opinion of many researchers out there, that it is well worth the extra work when your students achieve more in less time. The learning curve can be steep, and critics argue that there isn't enough research to support the benefits of differentiated instruction and that added prep time. It's good to know the potential downside of anything before you do it, but I think the evidence here shows that differentiated instruction is well worth the effort. So the good people at Edutopia have provided us with 18 teacher-tested strategies to differentiate instruction. The first is to use inquiry to encourage student ownership. Chad Brannon shared this. I find that inquiry activities and open-ended projects allow for maximum creativity and differentiation. I allow my students to collaborate on and evaluate our rubrics to give them ownership. Project-based learning allows my students to go at their own pace and helps to push themselves at their own level. When the student owns the learning process, differentiation naturally occurs. See, Brannon is essentially telling us that inquiry equals engagement. I've used this in my classroom and I've enjoyed high levels of engagement. Once a student wants to know something, the task transforms from an assignment to a quest, and that can change everything. The second teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is survey and tie student interests into the content. Diane Van Dyke, a middle school special education teacher from New Jersey, shares with us about tapping into student interests. Interest surveys are a great tool. For example, students can compute football scores for math. According to brain researchers, relating math and other subjects to personal experience jumpstarts the brain. Part of creating a positive relationship with each student is finding out about the things they like and dislike and the things that interest them. Tapping into something that the student already enjoys thinking about or doing opens up a world of motivation, and what's better, it can be contagious. The third teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is to stimulate the student's senses. Johanna, a 3rd and 4th grade special education teacher from Chester, West Virginia, stated, I differentiate by incorporating visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic components into my lessons as much as possible. I use graphic organizers frequently to aid in my comprehension and to map out ideas as we cover key skills. I use picture cards to correspond with the vocabulary words so that students will have a visual support to picture a word's meaning in their mind. I use manipulative objects in math class quite frequently. Of course, I also have to modify assignments and assessments for some of my students, but they are still focusing on the same skills and concepts that their peers are working on. See, Johanna understands that when you stick to stimulating the same senses over and over again, two things might happen. Those that are most stimulated by those senses will become burnt out, and those who are not will never have a chance. The fourth teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is to think about the whole child, to use multiple approaches. Educational consultant and blogger John McCarthy writes in his article entitled How Learning Profiles Can Strengthen Your Teaching that placing learners into a single learner-style container ignores the reality of the whole person. Teachers need to cross-train students by using 2 or more approaches to thinking styles, profiles, and planning differentiation. This is where learning profile cards, student profile surveys, and student learning perceptual quick surveys can provide detailed insight about students that spans across multiple thinker processing categories. John understands how knowledge of your students' learning profiles can provide critical insight into how instruction can best benefit them. Armed with this knowledge, a teacher can be sure to plan instruction that has the deepest level of impact on the largest number of students. The fifth teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is give students choice and vary your assessments. A high school social studies teacher from Pennsylvania, Sarah Minnick, says, differentiation comes from giving students choices in how they complete a targeted goal. Each format hits the essential question, but scaffolds it in a way that will allow the student to express their knowledge in a way best suited to them. I equate it to the variety cereal pack. Would you want to do the same type of assessment day in and day out? You still want to eat cereal, right? Just not the same kind every day. Allowing students multiple ways to express their learning will ensure that all of the appropriate evidence of learning is discovered. Providing only one type of assessment forgoes much of the evidence of learning that a teacher needs to effectively drive instruction. The sixth teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is to gather background information on your students prior to the start of the year. Deborah, a pre-K teacher from North Carolina, tells us, Generally, within the first couple of weeks, I can get an idea of what prior knowledge my children have retained and what direction I need to begin with them. However, my first action is reviewing my students' files and finding out as much information as I can prior to their arrival in my class. Talking to guidance counselors, prior teachers, and members of the administrative team about students and gathering relevant information about them beforehand can expedite the relationship building process with students and get them bought in much earlier in the year. The result, higher student achievement from the start. The seventh teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is to offer individualized feedback for each student. Chad Sansing, a middle school humanities teacher from Charlottesville, Virginia, said, "I work with students who experience some difficulty with executive function, the ability to self-monitor and self-prioritize tasks. I try to provide personalized, flexible work plans and individualized feedback that students can use to track completion and mastery of their own work and learning to help them organize themselves rather than depending on adults in the classroom to do that for them." Feedback is essential to performance. We all want positive feedback, and it can be very powerful. Often we overlook the power of constructive feedback. When we learn to view constructive feedback as a plan for improvement rather than an assault on our ego, we can encourage ourselves and our students for meaningful improvement. The eighth teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is remember that you are probably already differentiating. We spoke earlier about how time was the biggest barrier to implementing differentiating instruction into your classroom. This might remind you that you probably are already doing it to a much greater extent than you believe. Whitney Hoffman, the producer of LD Podcast, offers us this advice. "I hear in professional development meetings all the time that no one ever has time for X or Y. It's in part about priorities, and it's in part about giving people easy ideas so that differentiation is not some scary monster. It may be something that they are already doing. They just don't realize it." When confronted with the task of differentiation, it is easier for educators to become concerned with the resources required, especially time, to differentiate. In reality, differentiation is not doing completely new things on top of what we currently do. Rather, it is doing the things that we do already in a better way to increase student achievement. In many cases, as Hoffman suggests, we are already differentiating and we don't realize it. The ninth teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is explain fairness to avoid negative competition. Special education teacher John Wopat offers this. "I co-teach in a 4th grade inclusive classroom. We always like to remind our students that fair is not everyone getting the same thing, but rather everyone getting what they need to be successful. Going over this concept has helped eliminate a competitive mindset in our students, where they are overly concerned about their assignment or project in comparison with their peers. Society teaches our kids to be competitive with each other. As long as it doesn't go too far, that can be healthy. But kids are very familiar with competition between people. As teachers, we need to teach those kids how to be competitive with themselves when it comes to learning. In this way, they will want to dig deeper and learn more about everything." The 10th teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is assign peer helpers doing group work to help with accountability. James, a special education teacher, shares this. "We've had a hard time finding ways to help our 6th graders learn different concepts and stay focused. We assigned each student a peer helper and they responded well to that. They assist each other in the work. The peer helper makes sure that the student got all the notes copies and completed their work for that day." Now, most teachers understand the roles of students as our clients. James understands that students can also play the role of a resource. By utilizing the skills of our students that quickly master a concept to help those who do not acquire the concept so quickly, teachers can relieve some of the burden while tapping into the ability of students to relate to each other. The 11th teacher-tested strategy for differentiated instruction is to share your own struggles and strengths with students. Middle school teacher Erica Saunders states, "With the students I teach, I often find that their confidence and self-esteem is pretty damaged. Much of what I do to differentiate is to find out what they are good at and helping them begin to be successful. Everyone is good at something, and everyone has difficulty in something. I share with students that I'm a really bad speller. I share my shortcomings with them and how I overcame them. Erica understands that teachers must model the behavior they want to see from their students. If we want to celebrate each other, we have to know what we're good at. Equally so, we must also know the things that we are not good at. So as teachers, we can model how to attack and overcome our barriers. The 12th teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is use mini lessons to reinforce goals. Blogger Andrew Miller, from his 6 strategies for differentiated instruction in project-based learning, shares this. In addition to being great management strategy to prevent time sucks in class, mini lessons are a great way to differentiate. Perhaps you offer mini lessons to support your students' learning. After reflection and goal setting, this is a great way to have them connect their goals to specific mini lessons. Not all students may need the mini lesson, so you can offer or demand it for the students who will really benefit. Mini lessons can reinforce key information or reinforce key concepts in our content instruction. These short lessons are ideal for closing gaps in student learning. Best of all, they do not take very much of our extremely valuable instructional time, yet they can yield significant results. The 13th teacher-tested strategy for differentiating instruction is ask open-ended questions. Whitney Hoffman shares her insight into open-ended questions. She tells us that some kids will give elaborate sentences and others more to the point. Some won't answer the question or prompt at all, but will write something completely different. Some will surprise you with their understanding and depth of knowledge. This sort of prompt or question will let every kid, regardless of their ability, approach the problem and give you a better sense of what they know than a multiple choice test ever will. The power of open-ended questions is the amount of data that student answers provide for us. Their response for one prompt, as teachers, we can discern their writing skills, their knowledge of the content, their perspectives, and their experiences. Compared to other forms of assessment, open-ended questions provide far more usable data to drive instruction. The 14th teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is figure out what's essential. Scott Gunderson shares this with us about the benefits of narrowing the scope of instruction. My answer is not to try to cover it all. Choose the essential standards for your course and hit them very hard from multiple perspectives and with engaging activities and appropriate practice. Expect mastery at the core material from all students, but be reasonable. This is, to me, the heart of differentiation. Challenge each student appropriately and engagingly. Scott understands how easy it is for our students to lose the forest through the trees. Sometimes when it's appropriate, it is best to narrow the standards we cover while at the same time taking understanding of those standards to a much higher level. Although this practice is not ideal for all students, it is differentiated because it pretty much helps our students achieve mastery no matter what level they are at. The 15th teacher-tested strategy for differentiated instruction is group students with their strengths and interests in mind. This is a great example of a form of differentiation that many teachers were already doing in their classrooms and didn't even realize that it was differentiation. A high school English teacher, Melissa Hansen, tells us that knowing how to group students is key. If you can find students with similar interests and existing friendships, those groups can be powerful. Also, just because the students have different learning abilities doesn't make them less valuable to the group. For example, a dyslexic student might excel in leadership qualities, whereas a gifted and talented student might be an introvert. Both can help each other by working together. Most teachers utilize grouping during their instruction. However, many do not apply any science to their grouping decisions. Melissa shared with us that a purposeful grouping in which students' strengths and weaknesses become complementary will yield the best results. The 16th teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is to set high expectations and support growth. A middle school math and science teacher from Leawood, Kansas, Marshall Ratzel, states, "I swing for the fences. By that I mean I teach to the top of the class and figure a way to get the rest up there. If you do that, they learn to expect more from themselves and they learn to be a team, helping each other to do more than they thought they could and finding ways to compensate. Marcia touches on one aspect of differentiation that is sometimes confusing. Differentiation does not mean that you meet each student where they are. Does mean that you meet each student where they are. However, it does not mean that you have different outcomes in mind. When we shoot for mastery, we may very well be surprised how hard students will push themselves or how well they will do. The 17th teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is consider a time limit for homework. This will be a very popular strategy with students. JM, a middle school mathematics teacher, shares this with us. I differentiate homework giving a base assignment and requiring 20 minutes of honest work rather than completion of the problems. My experience is that the majority of students will complete the assignment, while those with real difficulty will work for 20 minutes and have a parent sign off to that effect. That's not my requirement, but one self-imposed by students and parents. By limiting the amount of time required to complete homework assignments, there can potentially be a multitude of benefits. Among those are greater student buy-in, increased likelihood that students will complete the assignment, and greater satisfaction with the course. In the busy world that we live in, finding time for homework can often be quite a burden. Students and parents alike will appreciate the effort, and student learning should not diminish as a result. The 18th and final teacher-tested strategy to differentiate instruction is group based on goals, not labels. DC, who teaches a 7th and 8th grade language arts class, offers us this. Defining student potential based on the labels they've been given is a mistake. I often find students that have been labeled as underachievers provide unique and resourceful perspectives to the classroom. Gifted students get bored if not challenged. The key for me has been to keep goals attainable and provide suitable, varied resources. DC brings to light the potential we have as teachers to be motivated by labels that we or others have placed on students. These labels are often contraindicators of the ability to tend to diminish our expectations. Rather, he wisely encourages us to be goal-oriented and believe that all of our students can attain the goal with the appropriate amount of support. So I've thrown a lot of information at you. I want to leave you with an overview of what we discussed today so that we can hopefully take some of these ideas from teachers like you and I from all over the world and implement them into our practice. Although differentiation is a process and not an end result, we have to start somewhere. We began by looking at Carol Tomlinson's idea that differentiation is the teacher's response to the learner's needs to best reach each student. We looked at some of the things that differentiated instruction is, as well as some of the things that it is not. Differentiated instruction is often misinterpreted and misunderstood. We then discussed on how differentiated instruction is rooted in both Bloom's taxonomy and Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Then we explored the pros and cons of differentiated instruction, highlighting that we often believe that implementing differentiated instruction will be more difficult than it really is. Further, we explored how, according to Tomlinson, teachers can differentiate instruction in 4 ways: content, process, product, and learning environment. We looked at each of those 4 modalities and explored practical ways to implement them into our practice. Finally, thanks to the good people at Edutopia, we reviewed 18 different strategies that we can implement into our instructional practice to help differentiate for our students. I'll quickly review those lists. They are to use inquiry to encourage student ownership, to survey and tie student interests into content, to stimulate the student's senses, to use multiple approaches to instruction, to vary your assessments, to gather background information on your students prior to meeting them, to offer students individualized feedback, to remember that you're probably already differentiating, to explain fairness and avoid negative competition, to use peer helpers to increase accountability, to share your struggles and strengths with your students, to use mini lessons to reinforce goals, to ask open-ended questions, to figure out what is essential, to group students by strengths and interests, to set high expectations to support growth, to consider time limiting your homework assignments, and then finally grouping students based on goals, not labels. I recognize that this was a lot to take in, and you may want to reference this video again throughout the year to help keep you on track. The main point is just to try to implement some of these strategies at first. Certainly do not attempt to try them all at once. Start small, consistently adding in new strategies as you become aware of barriers to learning. The only way that you fail at differentiating instruction is to not try. Don't be too hard on yourself, and try to learn from your mistakes, and your students' level of achievement will likely rise for your efforts. Before I close, I'd like you to leave you with 3 quotes from well-known leaders in the field of differentiation. This one from Ignacio Estrada. If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn. Another quote from Howard Gardner. The biggest mistake of past centuries in teaching has been to treat children as if they were all variants of the same individual, and thus to feel justified in teaching them the same subjects in the same ways. And then finally, from Carol Ann Tomlinson, I'm often asked how to get started with differentiation. Study your students. Work steadily to understand them better as individuals. Observe what encourages and discourages them. Listen to the stories they want to tell you. Our students will need our best if we are ever to see their best. Differentiating instruction is among the best ways to accomplish this. If you haven't already, I hope you will try and implement some of the strategies immediately into your practice. If you've already implemented differentiation into your instruction, keep watching, keep analyzing, and continue to try to reach each and every kid. Not only are you capable, but your students deserve no less. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.